Good afternoon, vinyl peoples. Ken McAuliffe here, the jazz vinyl lover. I am back once again, and today I want to talk to you about jazz vocalist. There's no more contentious thing from my seat as to what actually constitutes a jazz vocalist. Now today, when the predominant rhythm in culture is hip-hop, it's easy to spot somebody singing a jazz tune because the rhythm really stands out as being something different. The old ding, ding, da, ding, ding, the basic swing beat that used to infuse almost all music in America past the war. Back in the day, you would have people like Bobby Darin or Della Reese or any number of people who would sing to what was essentially a jazz beat, even though they were not jazz singers. I wouldn't call Bobby Darin a jazz singer or Paul Anka, but all of those people would sing a song at one point or another with an arrangement that wherein the rhythm was comprised of a swing rhythm. Ding, ding, cha-ding, ding, cha-ding. You know, like Fly Me to the Moon. Dum, da, da-dum. Fly me to the moon, a basic jazz swing rhythm that used to be everywhere after the war. You know, it takes a long time for musical styles to be absorbed and then disappear. So after the war, during World War II, big band was the biggest style of music. And then we had bebop, then we had bop, then we had post-bop. But even through the 60s, if you look at like the bands that would play on Johnny Carson, Tonight Show, big band, was still basically jazz music, was still a very common currency in American music. That's a long way of saying that now in retrospect we listen to singers who would sing with a jazz beat, but they're not really jazz singers. I have this, this pops up occasionally in my vinyl group, Jazz Vinyl Lovers on Facebook, and somebody will say, well, there's a swing beat, must be jazz. But it has more to do, I believe, with vocal phrasing than it does with the rhythm, because the rhythm, the swing beat, was so common in the 50s and much of the 60s, and even in the 70s, early 70s, because of all the big bands. But now that's entirely gone. It's not common. My very long way of saying, I want to present records to you that are some of my favorite jazz vocalist records, and these are pure jazz vocalists. There's no maybe, if, ands, or buts. Like a guy who sang back in the 60s and still alive today, the great Jack Jones. Let me grab his record. A wonderful, consummate lounge singer. One of the greats. You know, I think this was a big hit he had, Wives and Lovers, the Burt Bacharach tune. But is he a jazz singer? No. Is he a great singer? Yes. But on the other hand, someone like Frank Sinatra is such a massive talent. Besides Miles Davis and Duke Ellington, I think one of the few American artists who constantly reinvented himself. Frank influenced not only great jazz singers, but all great jazz instrumentalists because of his command. Sinatra played the big band like an instrument, and you can really hear that if you go back and hear air checks or whatever. Anyway, so let me just run through a few of my favorite jazz records. And these are actually hard to find. Mark Murphy on Fontana. Mark Murphy just died a few years ago, a very unique singer. When he sings, you can hear the history of jazz. You can hear bebop, you can hear post-bop, you can hear that easy listening thing that's popular in the 70s. I have a few of his records, and as I said, they're hard to find. He was just so overflowing with talent and swing and great vocal tone. It's almost hard to quantify him as a jazz singer, but he is a jazz singer. But he was so talented and really got inside a song and made it his own. A really wonderful vocalist. And if you find his records, this is an early one on Fontana. I think it's a reissue actually. Grab them because he swings his nuts off, as we say. I love it when I run across groups who I've never heard of. The Novi in Wonderland. This is an early Saba record, which I think eventually became MPS. Singing in 4-part harmony that began with the Four Freshmen. Another group who I love, even though the records can get kind of small, she's Singers Unlimited. They have a record with Art Van Dam. I believe it's called Untitled, which is just fantastic. They also did a record with Oscar Peterson that's pretty highly thought of, even though I'm not an Oscar Peterson fan. But Novi in Wonderland, kitschy cover, 4-part harmony, hip arrangements, early 70s. I think one of the greatest jazz singers, who's sort of forgotten now, is the great Carmen Mccray. This is an early record I found. It's an early Decca pressing with Ray Bryant on piano. You can barely see it. And I can't make out the other dudes. That might be Walter Perkins on drums. To me, she epitomizes a jazz vocalist. She was there during the early big band era, throughout the 50s, She's one of the few women who came out. She was gay. I guess she didn't come out during that period, but she was gay. You know, and kind of a rougher, ballsier tone. To me, Diana Krall is an extremely weak version of Carmen Mccray. There's a lot of blues in her voice, a lot of sing, there's control, a lot of power, a sense of knowing. She's very witty, and I just love the way she sings. She sang all the standards. I Can't Escape Dream My Funny Valentine, the little things that mean so much. East of the Sun, Dream of Life. I guess today's greatest jazz singer today would be Cecil McLaurin Salvant. She's the new Ella, but she's so much more, and she takes on social issues. A couple more Carmen Mccray records. The Sound of Silence. She even did a really funky record on Blue Note with Harvey Mason on drums. I love this hip. I've just dropped a tab of blotter acid sort of cover. An early Atlantic pressing. Well, it's a reissue actually. I love many Frank Sinatra records, but this is the one I know the best. Had Strangers in the Night. There he is, commanding the orchestra. The band on this thing is the perfect example of Frank Sinatra running the band. Just the tone of his voice, you know he's counting off all the tempos. They do great songs, they do cheesy songs on this record. Strangers in the Night, Summer Wind, which is the quintessential big band summer song, All or Nothing at All, Call Me, You're Driving Me Crazy on a Clear Day. My Baby Just Cares for Me, which is really cheesy, but this is such a fun record. It's extremely well recorded. A very fast tune called The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, where they're just flying. I can't recommend this record enough. You know, young listeners will say, Frank Sinatra, what a cheeseball. But any great jazz instrumentalist worth his salt is going to praise Frank Sinatra. And of course, Ella Fitzgerald. You know, Ella was kind of a rock star back in her day. You can hear concerts where she's playing in Europe and Japan, and she was worshipped and adored. Perfect swing, perfect tone, perfect phrasing. It's a little too perfect for me sometimes, but there's no getting around how brilliant she is. Her records with Louis Armstrong are you know, the American Songbook classic, the standards, the quintessential version of the American Songbook tunes were actually sung by Ella Fitzgerald and Frank Sinatra. To me, the greatest jazz singer, hands down, par excellence, who ever walked the earth, Betty Carter. Talked to many young jazz musicians and old jazz musicians who got their start with Betty Carter. Her band was like a proving ground for young jazz musicians in New York. Kenny Washington, Billy Drummond, I believe, Bernard Harper, Stephen Scott. So many young players came to her band. I remember Kenny Washington saying that she would often start the gig out, the first tune would be super fast. You had to just jump on that train and ride or fall off the bandstand, I guess. But I would buy any record I find by her. She has a record with Betty Carter where she's playing it kind of cute, and she doesn't swing as hard because she's singing more R&B. I mean, with Ray Charles, rather. And that's a really great record. And that's kind of what brought her to public consciousness, I suppose. But I love Betty Carter. She's so unique. Her singing style hints at avant-garde, at post-bop, at what's to come. She was a really futuristic jazz singer. I have a couple other Betty Carter records here. And when you find them, they're cheap, because nobody gives a shit about true jazz vocalists anymore. Round Midnight, Atco. I think this is a pretty old press. And dig the inner sleeve artwork. Pretty cool, huh? And just a CBS reissue. Probably was $5.99, a nice price. Social Call. All her records are great. Can't go on Betty Carter. And of course, a little more left field, Jeane Carne on the Black Jazz label. Jeane did these, she sings beautifully on these records. She's almost too slick for these Black Jazz records. She's so sophisticated and so smooth. But what a present. She went on later to have, I think, some disco hits in the 80s. Anyway, that's my take on jazz vocalist. In general, jazz vocal records are hard to find, which is weird. They probably never sold that well unless they had hits. There's a Carmen Mccray and Sammy Davis Jr. record that's pretty hip, was reissued on CD. Other records are hard to find, easy to find rather. And of course, all these records can be found from time to time at Jazz Record Center in New York City, where I work on Saturdays. Thank you so much for checking in and listening to me ramble and raggle and be a rascal. And let me know what you think. I'd like to know your favorite jazz vocalist. Have a great one.